Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at just mainly an indicator of some current indicators of economic performance. And look, a really important part of the exam is to be able to evaluate policies. So I'm going to take you a few just tips and tricks you can use when you're evaluating given policies, whether it's budgetary policy or monetary policy, an idea for common access resources, and then some things related to monetary policy, supply side policy, and the multinational diverted profits tax. So firstly, this came out yesterday. These are the October figures. So in relation to October, you can see you need to be mindful of the current statistics related to economic growth, employment and inflation. So both inflation and economic growth are at 1.8%. As you can see, growth is down from last year and inflation is up from last year. And unemployment's at 5.5%, down from 5.7%. Whenever you're talking about the effectiveness of monetary budgetary policy, you need to reference these to describe how effective they've been. So, for example, monetary policy has been effective at controlling inflation, but perhaps less successful at trying to promote economic growth and employment. Despite the reduction in employment and unemployment, there's been a decrease in economic growth. So you need to refer to these figures when you're talking about the success of the policies. As you can see, employment growth has been quite strong. The wage price index growth is still quite low at 1.9%. The exchange rate is pretty much roughly what it was last year. The cash rate's not that important. This is a big one. The current account deficit is much lower than what it was last year. That's as a result of higher export volumes as well as higher commodity prices. So the current account deficit as a percentage of GDP is only 1.6%, down from 4.5% last year. This is very meaningful, and it's mainly related to the balance of merchandise trade because we're selling more exports at a higher price. Foreign debt has also decreased as a result of issuing equity mainly to fund our current account deficits. That's gone down to 56.4%. Really important figures, particularly the first three. In the year to September, the number of workers employed full-time has actually increased 3.9%. So part-time employment's only gone up 1.4%. So it's actually been a sign that the labour market's getting stronger because there's more full-time employment. Although that hasn't had a big impact on the unemployment rate yet, because anticipation rate's also been rising, unemployment's only gone down by 0.2% despite the fairly rapid increase in employment throughout that period, particularly full-time employment. What you need to be able to do is you need to be able to evaluate monetary, budgetary and supply side policies. So you might get a question that asks you to evaluate monetary policy and its effectiveness in achieving domestic economic stability over the last 3 years. In order to do that, you need to be able to define domestic economic stability. Within that, define each of the three goals briefly, but make sure you include the main features of each of them. That would be how you would start the question. Then you would talk about the fact, what's the stance been over the last 3 years? So it's been highly expansionary. We've gone from interest rates of 2.5% to 1.5%. It's highly expansionary, and explain how that's meant to promote growth through a channel. So you've now given indication that you know the definition of domestic economic stability, you know what the monetary policy stance has been, and you can explain what impact that's meant to have through aggregate demand. Okay, then you need to talk about the fact, well, are we achieving this goal? And at the moment, you could say we've made some success. We've been successful in keeping inflation under control, but the expansionary stance has had some success in reducing unemployment, but growth is still relatively weak. So you need to analyse why it might not have been as effective as potentially it could have been with reference to these figures. So some of the reasons for the limitations might be the banks not passing on the rate cuts. We'll talk about how the RBA only got control of the cash rate. There's now a bigger gap between cash rate and commercial interest rates. People are deleveraging because of high levels of debt, as well as the fact that potentially they can't target particular sectors of the economy, and also the large impact lag. So you need to really refer to your weaknesses or limitations of monetary policy to answer this question in terms of evaluating how effective it's been. It's been less effective because of each of these reasons. Banks not passing on the rate cuts, more deleveraging, the inability to target particular sectors, and the long impact lag. And then finish your answer with some form of overall conclusion. So overall, despite having some success, it has a number of limitations related to trying to boost economic growth, but it has had some effect as evidenced by the lowering of unemployment. Again, it's about being able to evaluate how monetary policy has been used. Same with budgetary policy. Define domestic economic stability. Explain the stance of budgetary policy. So, sorry, I haven't changed this slide to talk about budgetary policy. Just ignore this bit. I'll come back to it. You also need to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of budgetary policy as a means of reducing unemployment. So if you got asked this question, evaluate the possible effectiveness of budgetary policy to reduce unemployment. When you're evaluating something, what you're doing is evaluating the strengths and weaknesses and coming up with a conclusion. So you want to talk about the strengths, weaknesses of budgetary policy, and then have an overall conclusion. Now you can answer this question more generically about the budget as a whole, or you can talk about a particular policy within the budget and analyse the strengths and weaknesses of that. So I'm going to take you through three policies, three key things you need to be able to do in case you need to be able to evaluate a particular policy on your exam. So the first one, if you say, one thing we could do to reduce unemployment is implement lower income taxes as part of an expansionary budgetary policy to try and promote growth. And then you need to analyse the effectiveness of that. So in terms of the strengths, increased disposable income should boost aggregate demand to increase consumption spending. That will flow on to increased production and boost real GDP. Analyse why it has a strength in boosting consumption spending. Another strength is that if we use lower income taxes, we not only get the demand benefits, we also get the supply benefits. So lower income taxes should promote participation because more people want to join the labour force. It can also help to increase productivity because of that increased competition for jobs, and eventually that increase in participation should also boost our international competitiveness. So we really analyse the strengths of this through those two main things, the demand and supply side benefits. You can also talk about the short impact lag that generally occurs as another strength with income taxes. In terms of weaknesses, most policies take a long time to get through the Senate. So the lengthy implementation lag associated with any tax cuts can make it less effective in trying to promote growth and therefore trying to promote jobs. Any expansionary policy, not just lower income taxes, can also lead to crowding out. So when the government borrows from the private sector, that can lead to higher interest rates, which might negate some of the expansionary impact that we're trying to achieve with these lower income taxes. There's no guarantee that people will spend the extra money, so it might not have much of an impact on unemployment, because particularly when confidence is low, people aren't going to actually spend the extra money, and therefore they might have a higher propensity to save, and therefore it doesn't have that desired impact. And lastly, it could just lead to less underemployment. People could use the tax cuts to purely, when people start spending more, businesses might just increase their employees' hours as opposed to actually hiring more people, and then come up with a conclusion. Despite these shortcomings, it's likely to see that lower tax rates will have a beneficial impact on the rate of unemployment. So to really analyse that policy in terms of its strengths and in terms of what are some of the issues that might be caused by this particular policy. The same with infrastructure spending. If you get asked to evaluate the effectiveness of one budgetary policy that might be announced to achieve full employment, define the goal of full employment. With infrastructure spending, you could talk about the strengths being that it has both short and long-term benefits for employment. For in the short term, the construction phase could link it to the Brisbane to Melbourne inland rail network. That's likely to lead to increased G2, leading to increased jobs, which will boost consumption and have multiplier effects throughout the economy. It also has benefits for full employment in the long term through increasing aggregate supply. For the increased productivity, again, link it to the Brisbane rail network and getting trucks off the road and reducing transit times and giving us access to overseas markets through ports, connecting regional areas. This will lead to increased productivity, lower prices, and therefore boosting our international competitiveness. So you've really elaborated on what are the strengths of this infrastructure policy for employment in both the short and long term. In terms of weaknesses, there can be a long implementation lag. Often policies related to infrastructure can be unpopular because people need to relocate. It can take a long time to get through the Senate. You could even mention the East-West link as an example there. It can also have negative impacts in the short term through impacts on supply, through traffic jams and roadworks and things like that. It can also conflict with other goals, so it can lead to increased budget deficits. You could talk about how this leads to crowding out and might lead to increased interest rates as the demand for borrowed funds increases. And potentially it might lead to more underemployment instead of reducing unemployment as well. I wouldn't be worried too much about that one. But really elaborating on these strengths, what it's designed to do, and what are some of the weaknesses we might face in relation to infrastructure spending. And lastly, with company taxes, you could talk about how it private investment spending, also helps promote foreign investment because overseas companies were more likely to put their to establish businesses here when our company taxes are lower. So you've got the double impact of both promoting private investment but also encouraging foreign investment. There's the short impact lag, which you can talk about should help to quickly stimulate growth. You can link to the fact that it helps to reduce firms' cost of production, which again allows them to charge lower prices. And all of this investment should help to boost productivity, increase our international competitiveness as we invest in new technology and machinery and so on. So really analysing the purpose of lower company taxes, what are the strengths in terms of trying to promote growth. In terms of weaknesses, you could talk about the fact that our company taxes are still much higher than many other countries. So that makes us less internationally competitive because we've still got higher cost structures here than they do overseas. That also reduces foreign investment. Lower company taxes make it harder for us to achieve fiscal consolidation and may lead to higher interest rates through crowding out. There's a large implementation lag. It's hard to get policy through the Senate, so it might be less effective because it takes too long. The increased spending from the tax cut might just reduce underemployment, so businesses might just increase their hours instead of hiring new people. And finally, firms might actually not even use the tax cut to invest, so firms might just absorb the extra profits. Particularly if confidence is low, it might not have the desired impact on investment. Firms may just instead decide to absorb those changes, lower taxes in terms of increasing their profits going forward. So you really need to be able to analyse each of these policies in terms of the strengths and weaknesses and really delve into these weaknesses. And the more that better you can articulate them, the better the quality of your answer for each of these different policies. Infrastructure, income taxes, company taxes, you can choose whichever one you're most confident with. There's a question here, but I'm not going to go through the whole thing, that's just the same question, but stepped out in more detail. In terms of lower wage growth, you need to be mindful that that's likely to help, when you're linking it to monetary policy settings. Okay, basically, lower real wage growth has helped to reduce demand pull and cost push inflation. So it's allowed the RBA to be more expansionary because their initial goal of inflation is under control, so they can focus on full employment and growth. On the demand side, it's led to lower real household disposable incomes, which has reduced demand inflationary pressures. On the supply side, it's helped to reduce real unit labour costs, so businesses don't need to raise prices. This all in all has helped to keep inflation below the target range of 2 to 3%, and enable the RBA to maintain an expansionary stance, loosen monetary policy, with the desire to try and boost jobs and growth. As I said, any question you're doing related to interest rates, link it to the charter, link it to the ability of, so if it's something about reducing inflationary pressures, state that it's going to help to achieve this goal, and therefore the RBA can focus more on these two second goals of full employment and prosperity. If it's something that's going to cause more inflation, then state they're going to be more worried about that because that's their primary goal and less worried about full employment and growth. So really linking it to the charter every time you're talking about how factors might impact the monetary policy stance. Last thing in this video, there was a question on the VCAR paper that asked you how the government can intervene to reduce the incidence of common access resources. A lot of people have been talking about how there's a lack of information if you're just talking about like using nets in Port Phillip Bay to try and reduce fishing and things like that. I would encourage you, if you've got a question like that by itself, so like this question by itself, and it was worth 3 marks, go down more the negative externality side of things. So for example, you could talk about our common access resource being clean air and a stable climate. And the reason it's a common access resource is because it's not excludable, you can't force people to pay for air, but it's rivalrous because some people's consumption or businesses' consumption can impact the quality of clean air for others. So you can link that to the fact that has been an increased incidence of climate change and carbon dioxide emissions, which has led to increased negative externalities from burning fossil fuels. So what the government have done is they implemented an excise tax, a carbon tax there. So the government increased the carbon tax. This helped to internalise the negative externalities by increasing the production costs of emitting CO2, which helped to reduce the incidence of airborne diseases, higher temperatures, and therefore has helped to shift resources into renewable energy sources and help to preserve our stable climates, which is the common access resource. So if you don't think that your particular answer has enough information on common access resources, I suggest you talk about the exercise